This is Andy Tube, and this is a check spring. Now it's also commonly called a take-up spring, and as most of you know, it's part of the needle thread tension unit. And it seems like in earlier service manuals they called it a check spring, and then later they started calling it the take-up spring. And as an example, as I look at the service guide for this 403 model Singer, that's called the 401A class, they called it a check spring. But the very next generation, the 500A Rocketeer, they called it a take-up. So this video is about setting the stroke and the tension of this check spring or take-up spring that's in the needle thread tension unit. And just my speculation, I think they called it a check spring because it checks against the tension of the unit to keep the needle thread have some tension on it, or prevent slack, so that the thread stays taut as it's going down into your fabric. And I did find one mention years ago in a industrial Singer about that. It was to prevent the needle from sewing onto its own thread. So and also, if you think about a take-up, the name take-up spring, it's because it works in conjunction with the take-up lever. There we go, with the take-up lever. So I'll explain this, what stroke is, and show you how to set it. And I'm going to explain the tension on this and how to set that if you feel it's necessary. So if you saw my video of this 403, I did a video on the tension unit, and I'll put a link to that below and at the end of the video if you haven't seen it. But you know, you take it off, you clean it, you put it back on, and I showed you how to zero it out. And you're thinking, okay, I'm so proud of myself, I'm done. And you sew and you have some tension problems. But you think, wait, it can't be a tension problem. I just did all that stuff. You know, my tension unit is clean, it's zeroed out, it's working really, really great. How can I have such a funny looking stitch? It may be then because of the stroke or the tension on here. So here's what stroke is. In that tension video, I explained these guys. Explained that there's a part here on one of the guides that's a little shelf or arm that sticks out right here, and it's called the stop or the rest. And if you remember, when you put your tension unit on or you're cleaning it, this little check spring has to be lifted up over so that it rests on the stop. So the travel of this is like up and down in this area right here, and that's called the stroke. How far it travels is called the stroke. So the idea of the stroke here is that when you are sewing and the needle is on the way down, it's going to keep tension on the needle thread as your needle's going down. But the stroke is that exactly when the eye of the needle enters into your fabric, that the check spring has come to rest on the little stop or rest. And when that happens, as your take-up lever continues down and the needle is now going down into the fabric, look what happens to your needle thread. Look at all this slack. Look how loose it is. Okay? So the check spring has kept that fabric, the thread taut as it's going down, but now as it's entered and the springs come to rest, it's not working anymore. It's not doing anything. So your needle thread has slack on it. And that's exactly what we want, because as you continue sewing, the hook is going to grab that needle thread and take it around the bobbin thread to make the lock stitch. So it has to have slack to do that, right? And then as the hook grabs the thread and wraps it around, the needle starts coming out. Now look, you have tension, the slack is gone, and you're getting some tension back on this thread. And you will see that the check spring starts doing its job again. See how it's lifting up there? And then, yep, see that? Then it starts the whole thing over. As the needle comes down, the spring should come to rest right as the needle enters the fabric to release the tension. Let the hook grab it, wrap it around, and then put tension back to pull it up. It's the same as if you were stitching by hand. You know, you put your needle through the fabric and you pull the thread through, and then you come back out of the fabric. Well, you have to pull up all that slack. You have to keep pulling until all the thread slack is gone. That's what your take-up lever is doing, and the check spring just keeps tension on the thread. So to test this, you have to kind of, because you don't want it to come to rest early and have too much slack before you're in the fabric, and you don't want it to come late, especially because your hook is grabbing it and trying to bring it around, and your check spring is still putting tension on it from the tension unit and stuff up here. So it's like both ends are pulling on that thread. And you can have noisy stitching from that fabric slamming the bobbin case back and forth against the bobbin case cushioning spring. You can have tight or puckered looking stitching. So that's why you check and set the stroke. So you can do it a couple of ways here, where you can lower your needle until you see the eye of the needle into the thread. Okay, and then if you look up here, your check spring should be on the rest, and mine is. And mine is. So I think, okay, but I don't know if it got here early because I was watching the needle down here. So I'm going to continue through this stroke, and now I'm going to go up and I'm going to watch. If you can watch both at the same time, go for it. But I'm going to watch this check spring now, and I just keep turning slowly, and I'm seeing it come down closer, 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 closer. Now, see, it stopped moving. It's rested. Now I'll leave it there, and I'll go down and look, and I'll say, aha, okay, the eye of my needle is not down in the thread. So in my case, and it's not, you know, it's like a 1/16 of an inch or 3/32, but it's not entering the fabric. So this would say it's coming to rest too soon, so that I'm having the tension released a little bit early. So what's the stroke supposed to be? Now, let's see if I can get under here a little bit. In most of the manuals for this type of a tension unit, and I know you've all seen different kinds of tension units and different kinds of check spring, like the check spring on the on Cute, the model 99 I did. You know, this part was the same, but what we call the U here, that was totally different. You know, it kind of came out and stopped. So there's different kinds, but they all work on this principle where they have something where the fat that actually the thread pulls on, they have a coil to create that tension, and most of them have this little folded coil that goes in a little bit that I call the springtail, that slides into a gear on the stud to stop it, that holds it. So when the thread moves it, it creates tension with the coil. Check, check, check. If it didn't have that springtail in there, when the thread brought it up, look, it would just, there wouldn't be any tension, you know. So Singer says on most of these types of unit, the space between this screw that holds this and the end of the slot that the screw goes through, the little space right here, is supposed to be about a 1/16 of an inch to 3/32, which would be like 2/32 to 3/32 in that area. Okay. And to shorten the stroke, you loosen this screw and you move this guide upward closer to the check spring, so the check spring doesn't you know, travel as far. All right. And if you want to make a longer stroke, you loosen the screw and you push this guide down, taking the little stop rest farther from the check spring, so it has to travel more before it comes to rest. So let's check again here. I'm going to do this. My spring just came to rest, and my eye of the needle is not into the fabric. So it would seem to me I need to make this stroke a little bit longer, right, so that the spring still had a little bit more to go before it stops, so that when it does, the eye of that needle would be in there. So let's see, we're going to loosen this up, the screw that mounts the two thread guides but also is used to adjust. I'm just going to loosen it a little bit, and then I'll show you, see if you see how that moved up. Now I'll move it down. Whoops, I gotta loosen a little bit more to move it down. There. So it goes down for a longer stroke, up for a shorter stroke. Down and up. So let's, just for the heck of it, let's move it all the way up. Okay, let's just move it all the way up and see what happens then. So to me, that should be a really short stroke, right? Okay, here it goes up, and the needle's heading down, and the spring is at rest right there, and my thing got worse. Now the point of the needle isn't even to the fabric, and the eye is much higher from the fabric than before. So I guess Singer knew what they were saying. So I'm going to loosen that, and I'm going to start adjusting this down because I need a little bit longer stroke. And here's one way that I've done this in the past to help me get close to what I need, is I will loosen that like I did, right? Just loosen that, and I will look very closely as my needle, and right as the eye enters the fabric, I'll leave that there. And then I will go up here and I will adjust this so that it touches the bottom of the check spring. See, I'll just gently push it up against the bottom of the check spring, and like about that, and I will, whoop, get a little carried away there, hold it there while I tighten it there. So then I will try again. I'll see how my adjustment did. So here my check spring is going up and the needle's coming down, and I'm going to watch the needle again, I guess, and right there it enters the fabric and I am at rest on the stop. So I'll do it again to see. So with the needle just entering, the eye of the needle just entering, I was at a stop or rest position. So now I'm going to do it again, and this time I'm going to watch when it stops and then look at the needle. Closer, closer, closer. Come down and stop. Right? Yeah, stop. Now I'll look at the eye of the needle, and I'm better than when I started this whole thing, but it still needs to go a little bit longer stroke, I think. I'm not quite, boy, it's really close, but I'm not quite there. So I'm just going to try a little bit more. Loosen it, and I'm just going to try and lower that just a tiny bit. Okay, and I'll check it again as it comes down. It just stopped, and now my eye of the needle has entered into the fabric. So I'll do it again, watching the needle, and there's my eye into the fabric, and I am at rest. So if I'm going to sew on an index card, I got it perfect, right? But under your presser bar foot, no matter how thick your fabric is, the top of it, you know, should be there, okay? But if it changes, if you have 2 layers of denim there, and it seems like this stroke is too long, you know how to adjust your stroke. You know, you can just loosen that screw a little bit and move this up until you get the timing where the eye of the needle entering the fabric, and at that moment the stop comes to a rest. Okay? Alright. So setting the stroke. Now, what about setting the tension of this spring? When in my tension video, I showed you that when you slide this check spring or take-up spring onto the stud and slide it back in there, that little tail has to go in one of the gears. And I advise you that to put it in the gear where the U, where this part that hangs down, that's going to check the spread, is hanging like straight down towards the bed of your machine. You know, don't put it up like that, and don't put it over. Try and get it as close as you can to hanging straight down while you're assembling your tension unit. Okay, and the idea of that is that puts about the right tension on this check spring. Now in their manuals, I found a couple places where Singer says you want the tension to just be enough to keep the thread kind of taut, you know, as the needle's going down. But you don't want it over tight, which really makes snappy sewing and pulls very hard against the bobbin case. Maybe you have some tight or puckered, you know, stitching. But you don't want the tension so light that it doesn't keep the thread, you know, taut as the needle's moving. Makes sense, right? Like everything on the machine, you know, you want a balance. So let's see if I can pull this thread out of here without taking it out of the needle. And let's get it on the finger. What you do with this, if you want to change that tension of the check spring, if you think you have you know, too tight or too loose, and sometimes you know, people I sell these machines to do some pretty heavy duty crafting. You know, put a big old number 18 needle in there and some very heavy thread, and they're sewing through duck cloth and canvas and garment leather and vinyl, and they feel like their tension on this spring is too light to keep that heavier thread in line. But you know, you don't want to take everything off to move that spring one way or the other for less tension or more tension. Have to put it back together and zero it out. So if you want to change the tension on that, what you do is you loosen the set screw here that holds the the tension stud, holds the whole unit in there. Just give it a good turn or two, and then just carefully pull the whole tension unit out. Now mine came out real easy because it's all clean, you know. You'll see in the tension video I did, sometimes you gotta wiggle it around or even spray a cleaner or WD-40 or something. But here's the unit all assembled, and we're going to look at the back end of it now to work on it. Okay? And we want to hold it in our hand the same way it sits on the machine, with the tension indicator straight up and in line with the tension stud. As we look at it, I'm going to go hold it by the thumb screw. Okay. And then we'll see where our check spring is. Okay. So if I wanted to, let's say, lighten the tension, I want the check spring to be moving closer, closer to the left, closer to where that stop is. If I wanted, so I would move the spring to the left. If I wanted more tension on it, I would want to move it farther away from the check spring. So instead of hanging like straight down parallel, I would want it over this way to put more tension. Or I'd want it over this way to put less tension. Okay? And remember, you have to keep this up while you're doing this. Okay? So the way to do that, be sure you have it up and in line, and you just pull that check spring towards you a little bit, because there's that little tail on the spring sitting between these two gear teeth right here. So you just pull it enough to get it out, get the tail out of those teeth, and then you move it, one or two to the left, one or two to the right, depending. Now if you want less, let me be sure I tell you this right. If you want less tension, you're going to move the tail left. If you want more tension, you're going to move it right. Kind of the opposite of when you're looking at it at the front. So I'm gonna go for a little less tension. And where this is sitting on this teeth, say at 1 o'clock, I'm going to move it back here one space, like to 11 o'clock. Okay, so I'm just going to pull it out, get that tail out, twist it a little bit, and come on you. Come on you. There. So my line is still on top. I've still got this lined up, but I moved the tail of that spring from, like I said, about 1 o'clock over to 11. Okay, so let me make sure I've got it in there. This is smooth. Let's go around and look at the front, how it's going to be on the machine. And let's see if I can hold it here. Get this top lined up. Get this down. Make sure my top is lined up here so I'm looking at it. And it did. Before, my spring was hanging kind of straight down. Now it's over here. It's pointing over here, which moved it closer to the check spring, right? Okay, so then I've made my adjustment. I'm going to put this put the whole unit back into the machine. Before I stick it in all the way, I like to move that check spring up on the stop, okay? And then I'm going to push it in all the way. Make sure I got my little finger in the hole up here, because that lines up the guide finger. Okay. Then when I have it in there, I'm going to hold it in there while I tighten that set screw back up. And okay, hold it in there nice and firm, and I'm going to tighten that set screw back up. There. Now I'll take a look at it and I'll see, does it feel, yeah, it does feel a little bit lighter. I mean, I can tell the difference, but of course we want to put our thread back in there. So I'll lift that up and slide my thread between my discs. Lift up the presser foot when I said lift that up. Make sure my thread's between the disc, and I'll lift that check spring straight up and put my thread next to the finger guide and then through the upper guide. And then I'll back wind my spool to get out the slack, lower my presser foot for tension. Now I'm just going to hand turn the wheel, and I want to see if this lighter check spring tension keeps enough tension on the thread. Yep, looks great, doesn't it? Right? Let's see, is it coming to rest here? It's going to come down. Eyes going in. Ooh, look at that. I'm not at rest anymore, even though the eye of my needle is in there. So changing my tension on this changed the stroke. So if I like my tension, which it looked good, it had plenty of tension, the thread wasn't flopping around, so I'm going to go back and adjust my stroke to make it a shorter stroke. So with the eye of the needle just entering my fabric, okay, then I'm going to raise that, move that up to the left so that my stop is against the bottom of the check spring there. Now let's give it a whirl. Okay, I'll check the needle first, and the needle yep, right there ending the fabric, and I'm stopped. Okay, now I'll watch this. Take my stroke, I go up, and it's down, 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 stop. Right, stop. And then the eye of the needle is entering the fabric. So at first I set the stroke and thought I had it perfect. But when I checked the tension on this, and I thought, man, that's kind of like more tension than I need, because I keep remembering that Singer says just enough tension on this little check spring to keep the thread from flopping around. So I lightened that tension, and that changed the stroke I needed. How about that? Was that kind of interesting? I hope so. I hope it was worth your time. Setting the stroke and tension on the check spring. Okay. And if I didn't have it right, if I did my little test sewing before my project with my needle and thread I was using, and I said, you know, I put less tension on this, but I don't like the stroke. I'm going to go back to more tension, or I need to put a little bit less, or something like that. You see, it is not hard to do by loosening that set screw a turn and being able to pull your whole unit out, make sure it's lined up straight, look at the back and pull that tail, move it one way or the other, stick it back in. And it's especially easy to do when you've had this out before and this unit out and everything is clean. It's real easy to make those kind of adjustments on a clean machine. Thanks for watching this video about the check spring or take-up spring, and I hope you will have time to come back and watch some more of my videos. Take care now.